Good evening. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On the NewsHour tonight, economic forecasts increasingly show the president's harsh tariffs having a major global impact.
The Vatican makes arrangements for the funeral of Pope Francis as speculation over his successor intensifies.
And the Supreme Court hears a potential landmark case regarding religious rights and public school curriculum.
If they rule in favor of the parents, certainly you're going to see more opt-outs in situations like this.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Kathy and Paul Anderson, and Camilla and George Smith.
Certified financial planner professionals are proud to support PBS NewsHour. CFP professionals are committed to acting in their clients' best interest. More information at letsmakeaplan.org.
The John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, fostering informed and engaged communities. More at kf.org.
At BDO, I feel like a true individual. People value me for me. They care about what I want, my needs, my career path. I matter here.
And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. President Trump's trade wars are likely to slow down economic growth across the globe significantly this year. That is the projection from the International Monetary Fund today, estimating the U.S. economy will slow down by an entire percentage point compared to last year, growing by just 1.8%. Global growth was projected to slow by half of a percentage point.
Tariffs and uncertainty are rattling other important parts of the economy. The dollar has continued its slide, and investors are showing that they have new worries about Treasury bonds, often some of the safest investments. But the U.S. markets rebounded substantially today. That came after Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent reportedly told investors that he believes the trade war with China is unsustainable and hopes tariffs on both sides could be eased. The Dow gained back more than 1,000 points, or 2.6%. The Nasdaq jumped 2.7%, and the S&P 500 also gained about 2.5%. And late today, President Trump suggested he was open to easing up on the trade wars with China.
I'm not going to say, I'm going to play hardball with China. I'm going to play hardball with you, President Xi. No. We're going to be very nice. They're going to be very nice. And we'll see what happens. But ultimately, they have to make a deal because otherwise they're not going to be able to deal in the United States.
To help us understand the volatility in the markets, let's turn now to longtime financial journalist and CNBC contributor Ron Insana. Ron, it's great to be able to draw on your insights on a day like today. Thanks for being here.
I was hoping to get some insights from you, Jeff.
We'll see about that, friend.
As much volatility as I've seen in my lifetime.
Well, let's talk about that, because the Treasury Secretary reportedly saying he expects a de-escalation in the president's trade war with China. You heard the president there himself. What's your read on all that's happening, and what is this potentially setting the stage for?
Well, they're most clearly and most definitively listening to the financial markets, as you both outlined at the top of the show. I mean, not only is global growth being downgraded, U.S. growth is being downgraded. The IMF actually behind private economists in doing that. And then you've seen these, ripples in the Treasury market, the decline in the dollar to a 3-year low, the turmoil in the stock market, and financial instruments are telling politicians, number one, moving this fast without a plan is a very bad idea. Some of the ideas themselves are bad, like potentially firing Fed Chairman Jay Powell, and also just engaging in an all-out trade war is detrimental to growth, if not devastating, should it become a full-blown international event. And so I think they're starting to get the message, and particularly the Treasury Secretary is probably trying to talk the president off the ledge, as it were, with respect to some of the more harsh comments he's made about Jay Powell recently, and also about this intensifying trade war with China, which the Treasury Secretary effectively called an embargo. That's a big word to use in an environment like this.
Well, you mentioned the markets, and let's talk more about that, because before today's rally, the Wall Street Journal noted that the Dow Jones Industrial Average was headed for the worst April since the Great Depression, since 1932, because of a lack of confidence by investors. I mean, is this period of volatility, is this our new normal, at least for as long as this tariff plan, this trade war lasts?
Yeah, I absolutely think volatility is going to remain elevated. I mean, maybe not to the extent that we saw in the last several weeks, but I do think that until we get clarity around where these negotiations are going and what the actual end game is, what we want from each and every one of our trading partners is clear, and whether or not there are agreements to be had. Remember, these often take months or years to construct, and they're trying to do multiple deals, as many as 70 deals within 90 days. That's something that I would assume is impossible. Progress on this front would be helpful to financial markets, to be sure, but the issues around that, whether or not we have a fully set of sustainable deals that are long-term in nature, is really what the market needs to calm down and start following more traditional metrics like corporate earnings, the direction of interest rates, should lower rates be warranted, things like that are germane to typical market behavior.
Well, the president, at least for today, is easing up on China. He's also easing up, apparently, on the Fed chair, Jay Powell. Today, he told reporters, he said, "I have no intention of firing him." Last week, he said, quote, "If I want him out, he'll be out of there real fast, believe me." The president is still voicing his desire for the Fed to cut rates. Is the Fed strong enough to resist the pressure? Because not every institution, not every American institution, as we've seen, has been strong enough to resist the pressure from the Trump administration.
Yeah, I think the Fed most definitely is. I think Jay Powell has even said, both privately and maybe even publicly, that he would spend every last nickel that he has fighting to stay in his job. And the Fed, as an institution, has been extremely independent as an agency for quite some time. And again, I think that the independence of the Fed is critical to the safety and soundness of U.S. assets, the way foreigners view the stability of the U.S. economy, the reliability of the dollar or U.S. Treasury bonds. All of those things are really important. Now, the Fed may still hear from President Trump, on an ongoing basis about lowering rates, but the Fed will do what it does when it needs to do it. So I think this is going to be no longer a test of wills. I think Jay Powell now, given that the president just said that today, that he has no intention of firing Jay Powell, which my colleague Eamon Javers at CNBC asked him about. I think we're okay until his term expires. Who he ultimately replaces him with is an open question. But I think the Fed, now that the president has backed off, will be able to withstand these pressures.
And lastly, Ron, when the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, slashes its U.S. and global economic forecasts, it says the U.S. economy is expected to grow by about 1.8%. That's down from its January estimate of 2.7%. Put that in plain English. What does that mean for the economy and the prospects potentially of a recession?
Well, the IMF appears to be slightly more optimistic than most private economists. We've heard estimates that there's as much of as a 90% chance of a recession if these tariffs remained in place for a sustained period. And so personally, I think 1.8% is a little bit optimistic if the tariff negotiations go on for several more months. We're already hearing that shipments of goods from China have all but ceased, and that ports in Los Angeles and Long Beach, California, have quieted down considerably and not receiving a lot of goods. And so these are long cycle types of phenomena that if indeed this were to persist for some time, getting 1.8% growth would be a victory, given that we grew about 2.5% last year. My guess is that we're going to grow under 1% this year if this type of uncertainty persists, both in terms of market behavior and ultimately in terms of businesses' inability to plan around the tariffs, whatever they might be. This is, as I said earlier, this is going to take time to work out. So the first 2 or 3 quarters of this year might be a little bit weaker than even the IMF is suggesting.
That is Ron Insana. Ron, always a pleasure. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
The Catholic faithful and many more around the world continue to pay their respects today to Pope Francis, one day after his death. An official period of mourning began in Italy that will last through his funeral this weekend, as security ramps up to prepare for the throngs of mourners and world leaders expected to gather in Rome. Malcolm Brabant reports once again from Rome tonight.
Lying in an open coffin under the watchful eye of Swiss guards, this was Pope Francis' silent farewell to the humble Vatican guest house that had been his home. Tomorrow, his coffin will be taken to St. Peter's Basilica, where he will lie in state and the faithful will come to pay their respects. Today, a gathering of cardinals announced that his funeral would take place on Saturday. Consistent with his humility, Pope Francis asked not to be interred in the Vatican, but in a beautiful church in Rome called Santa Maria Maggiore, in a simple wooden casket.
This is perhaps the last message he is giving, especially remembering that he wants to be buried under the shadow of a woman, in this case, Mary. This is also significant in terms of the Church's desire to do more for women.
The conclave to elect his successor will take place 3 weeks later in the exquisite Sistine Chapel. Although, theoretically, the selection process could take months, experts predict the cardinals will reach a conclusion relatively swiftly, as in recent times, in order to present a unified face to the Catholic world. Although the conclave to elect the new pope is not going to begin until the middle of May, behind the scenes, the debate amongst the cardinals has begun in earnest. Those over 80 are barred from taking part in the election, but Vatican watchers are certain that they're using their influence to try to pressure their younger colleagues to bend to their will.
I think this is going to be the mother of all conclaves, because there's going to be a very, very strong debate in secret in the Vatican over the next 3 weeks between those cardinals who would be happier to see a more traditionalist pope take over from Francis, and those who want his reforms to continue.
Author of The Promise of Francis, David Willey is a renowned Vatican expert, having covered 8 papacies. While conservatives within the Catholic hierarchy seek a return to traditional strict values, Willey believes that if the Church wants to remain relevant, it can't turn the clock back.
For most ordinary people, the issues at stake are pretty simple. Contraception, homosexuality, abortion. These are all issues which affect all families, and I think that the Church is going to have to deal with them on a much more human level than in the past, when it's tended to be dogmatic.
Although conservatives remain influential, Willey doubts they'll muster a majority among the 135 cardinals eligible to vote in the conclave.
It's only fair to say that more than 100 of the cardinals who will be taking part in the election were appointed by Pope Francis himself. So the chances are that you're going to get somebody who is very much in tune with the sort of papacy that we've just witnessed.
Across Africa, where Catholicism is surging, nearly 300 million people are hoping that the conclave will elect an African pope. Africa is more conservative than Europe. Religious leaders there believe that a liberal agenda has contributed to the demise of the Church. Geoffrey Kuku is rector of Lady of Peace Basilica in Yamoussoukro, Ivory Coast.
We pray to God that the new pope who will come will be an even more courageous pope, one who dares to make decisions against everything that is being spread in the name of globalization and civilization.
So for the next pope who will come, my greatest wish is that he be a black man.
As funeral preparations gather pace, Catholics are assessing Francis' legacy of groundbreaking leadership.
I think he has helped the Church to remember, yes, we are an institution, but we are primarily a community. We're a community of people who are privileged to have belief in God and who journey with others who don't necessarily have that faith, but we journey together to try and make this a better world. And that, I think, is his legacy. It's to say, look, your faith is something that should push you and encourage you to be working with others for the betterment of our world.
He was the first pope to endorse same-sex civil unions and called for the universal decriminalization of homosexuality. And while he raised women's profile within the church, Pope Francis maintained the status quo by ensuring the priesthood remained an exclusively male preserve. While his orders outraged conservative traditionalists, others argued that he didn't go far enough. Pope Francis also infuriated Israel because of his opposition to the war in Gaza and his support for the Palestinians. But today, in one of the most important shrines in Christendom, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, Patriarch Pier Battista Pizzaballa paid tribute to Pope Francis for advocating peace right until his death.
With the beginning of the war, 7th of October, the connection was stronger, and especially, as everyone knows, he was very close to the community of Gaza, the parish of Gaza. He kept calling them every evening at 7, became for the community something stable and also comforting for them. And he knew this.
But those thoughts aren't shared by the Israeli government, which deleted an online post offering condolences on the pontiff's passing. In death, it seems, Francis is still having an impact in the Middle East. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Malcolm Brabant in Rome.
In the day's other headlines, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth threatened possible criminal prosecution against former staff he accused of leaking information. That information involved Hegseth sharing airstrike logistics in another chat over the Signal messaging app, this one including his wife and brother. On his former Fox show this morning, Hegseth again denied sharing any classified information on Signal. Instead, he honed in on the internal investigation and recent removals of several of his top staff.
But we took it seriously. It led to some unfortunate places, people I have known for quite some time, but it's not my job to protect them. When that evidence is gathered sufficiently, and this has all happened very quickly, it will be handed over to DOJ, and those people will be prosecuted if necessary.
The Pentagon's Inspector General is investigating the Secretary and staff's use of the Signal app. Today, the White House again defended Hegseth as he faces mounting criticism about his job performance. Secretary Marco Rubio instituted a sweeping reorganization of the State Department today that includes cuts and the elimination of a key office that advances American values abroad. Some of the duties of that office will be folded into other parts of the department, but few details were provided. Rubio also announced that state plans to cut 15% of its U.S.-based employees. Turning overseas now, Russia is ramping up its attacks across Ukraine after Moscow claimed to have observed a brief Easter ceasefire. Overnight, crews battled burning buildings after Russian drones hit the port city of Odessa. Hours later, Russian glide bombs struck Zaporizhia, killing one woman. All this comes as both Moscow and Kyiv have signaled some openness to direct talks. A Kremlin spokesman said Russia would consider a Ukrainian ceasefire proposal on attacks to civilian infrastructure. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said that a ceasefire would open the door for more dialogue.
As for our delegation, it has a mandate for discussing an unconditional ceasefire or a partial ceasefire. We are ready for this stage. We are also ready to state that after the ceasefire, we are prepared to sit down in any format.
President Trump's Ukraine envoy, General Keith Kellogg, will represent the U.S. in a new round of peace talks tomorrow in London with Ukrainian and European officials. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff will visit Moscow this week for a new round of talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Authorities say at least 26 people are dead after 4 gunmen opened fire at a popular Himalayan mountain resort in Indian-administered Kashmir, the disputed territory between India and Pakistan. It was one of the deadliest attacks on civilians in the region in recent times. In addition to the dead, 36 others were injured, many seriously. Police and soldiers are still searching for the attackers, and there's been no claim yet of responsibility for the massacre. Meanwhile, on a visit to India, Vice President J.D. Vance said it's time for more collaboration between the world's two largest democracies. Speaking to business leaders, he warned of a very dark time ahead if the two countries didn't more closely align on everything from energy and defense to trade. The U.S. is India's largest trading partner. Vance knocked back criticisms that President Trump's aggressive tariffs were threatening that relationship and causing global turmoil.
Critics have attacked my president, President Trump, for starting a trade war in an effort to bring back the jobs of the past, but nothing could be further from the truth. He seeks to rebalance global trade so that America, with friends like India, can build a future worth having for all of our people together.
Vance met yesterday with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and both leaders cited significant progress toward a trade agreement. Both nations have set an ambitious goal to try and double bilateral trade by 2030. Today, a federal judge in Colorado extended her order blocking the Trump administration from deporting anyone in that state under the Alien Enemies Act, the rarely used wartime law passed in 1798. The ruling also said the government must give 21 days of notice before deportation to allow for contesting the removal in court. The Justice Department recently said it would give migrants only 24 hours notice before deporting them. The judge's order was the first to impose some due process rights for migrants, following a Supreme Court order earlier this month that migrants be given the opportunity to challenge their removals in court. A federal jury in Manhattan today found the New York Times did not libel former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin. Today's verdict came in a retrial of Palin's case, where she alleged that a 2017 Times editorial damaged her reputation by implying her political action committee helped to incite the deadly mass shooting in Arizona that severely wounded former Representative Gabby Giffords. The newspaper admitted the mistake and had issued a correction within hours. 3 more federal prosecutors who worked on the corruption case against New York Mayor Eric Adams have resigned. In a letter obtained by several media outlets, they said they were pressured to express regret to the Justice Department for refusing to drop Adams' case. They wrote, quote, "We will not confess wrongdoing when there was none. The department has decided that obedience supersedes all else." Adams had agreed to cooperate with the Trump administration's immigration crackdown, which led to the dismissal of his criminal case. At least 10 federal prosecutors in Manhattan and Washington have now resigned over that case being dropped. And the Trump administration announced a plan this afternoon to phase out 8 artificial dyes from the U.S. food supply by the end of next year. The petroleum-based additives are found in many grocery store staples, from cereals to sports drinks. But today, FDA Commissioner Marty Makary said it's critical to get them off of shelves. He cited some studies that found links between synthetic dyes and neurobehavioral issues in children. He called on food manufacturers to replace them with natural substitutes.
For the last 50 years, we have been running one of the largest uncontrolled scientific experiments in the world on our nation's children without their consent. And today, we are removing these petroleum-based chemicals from their food supply.
Today's announcement drew praise from advocates who say the dyes carry health risks but serve no purpose beyond the cosmetic. The FDA has long maintained that synthetic dyes are safe for consumption. Still to come, on the NewsHour, we examine the Trump administration's claim that student activists are undercutting U.S. foreign policy. The Education Department resumes collection of student debt from borrowers in default. And a new book chronicles the life of the trailblazing South Asian actress Merle Oberon.
This is the PBS NewsHour from the David M. Rubenstein Studio at WETA in Washington, and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
The U.S. Supreme Court heard arguments today in a major case focused on parental rights and public schools. At the center of the case is a dispute over curriculum in Montgomery County, Maryland, a Washington, D.C. suburb. In 2022, the county school board adopted a new language arts curriculum that included books featuring LGBTQ characters, including a picture book about a dog who gets lost at a pride parade, and others featuring transgender children. Some parents asked for their children to be opted out from the curriculum because the books conflicted with their religious beliefs. The board stopped allowing opt-outs the next year, arguing they were unmanageable and undermined their obligation to foster inclusive environments. That decision sparked protests and outrage from some parents in the community, some of whom were outside the court today.
We, on behalf of other parents sharing our faith, ask the Supreme Court to stand up for the rights of our children for us to raise our children in accordance with our faith and protect them from instruction on controversial topics that go against our deeply held religious beliefs.
The justice's decision could have major consequences for public schools nationwide. To explore today's arguments, I'm joined now by NewsHour Supreme Court analyst Marcia Coyle. Great to see you, Marcia.
Good to see you, Amna.
So before we jump into the details, just big picture, what stood out to you from the arguments today?
Justice Kavanaugh made a comment. He said, with religion cases, the court generally looks for a win-win, meaning both sides come away with something. No one is a big loser. But my sense was after today's arguments, there's no way yet that they found a win-win. They're looking for a rule, a line to draw, so that, as Justice Kagan says, you don't suddenly have opt-outs for everything in public schools, or as the parents, as the school board's attorney was asked, why do you want to die on this hill of no opt-outs? So the court is struggling here, and I think it's going to take them a lot of discussion.
Unclear where that line is
Yes,
right
exactly.
now. Well, there was some division on display among the justices, as you said. I just want to play a part of what Justice Alito and Justice Jackson had to say on this today.
The book has a clear message. And a lot of people think it's a good message, and maybe it is a good message, but it's a message that a lot of people who hold on to traditional religious beliefs don't agree with.
I guess I'm struggling to see how it burdens a parent's religious exercise if the school teaches something that the parent disagrees with. You have a choice. You don't have to send your kid to that school. You can put them in another situation. You can homeschool them. How is it a burden on the parent if they have the option to send their kids elsewhere?
Marcia, what do those arguments reveal to you about how they're thinking about this, and do you get a sense of which way they're leaning?
My sense was, and I hate to predict on arguments at all, but my sense was there may be more sentiment for the parents here than for the school board. Justice Alito's comments, he was most skeptical of the school board and the books and what the books convey, especially to pre-K students and kindergarten students. Whereas Justice Jackson, was looking at the law here. Courts have said that exposure of ideas that some may object to because of their religious beliefs, that does not violate the free exercise clause in the First Amendment. So the court spent most of the time, well over an hour, discussing, is this exposure through these books, or is it a burden? Is it coercion? So we're going back and forth with many hypotheticals about gay teachers, the books themselves showing a wedding of two men, and whether they're just exposing these kids to these ideas. The school board claims that these books are really designed to encourage civility and respect for others.
And in those hypotheticals, sort of leads me to my next question, which if the court does rule in the parents' favor, what are we talking about in terms of the impact this could have on public schools nationwide?
Well, if they rule in favor of the parents, certainly you're going to see more opt-outs in situations like this. Now, opt-outs are fairly common in high schools for certain reasons. You see them most often in health classes involving sex education, obviously. But as Justice Kagan pointed out, You might also see opt-outs requested for the teaching of evolution in biology and other reasons. But still, you may see more opt-outs on the basis of religious beliefs. For the school boards, too, though, it could be, if they lose, it could be an administrative nightmare. They say these books are part of the English language curriculum. It's not a single unit like sex education in a health class. So having kids moving in or out, trying to arrange when that happens, alternative education plans could really create problems for schools. And Justice Jackson also pointed out that if the parents win, she worries that local control of education is eroded, and you're going to find judges then deciding what kind of books can be used, what kind of books burden religion. And she didn't obviously think that was the right role for judges.
Yeah, Marcia, it's worth pointing out the court is hearing another case related to religion and schools next week. You have the 6-3 conservative majority that has backed religious rights arguments in the past. When you take a step back, what role is the Roberts Court playing when it comes to religious rights debates in this country?
Amna, I think that this is going to be one of the legacies of the Roberts Court since the Chief Justice joined in 2005. You have 3 religion cases this term. They are in very different contexts. But the Roberts Court has shown a trend of pushing for greater government accommodation of religion. And they've done that by elevating the free exercise clause over that other very important clause, the Establishment Clause, and that clause's concerns about government entanglement with religion. And I think that's something we'll see a little more dramatically next week when they take up the religious charter school case.
All right, we'll be waiting and watching. That is NewsHour's Supreme Court analyst, Marcia Coyle. Marcia, thank you. It's always great to have you here.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Late yesterday, a federal judge ordered the Justice Department to restore the revoked visas of a Mexican student and a British student and issued a temporary restraining order preventing their deportations. It's the latest case of international students targeted by the Trump administration's crackdown. According to immigration attorneys, over 1,000 student visas have been revoked this year as the Trump State Department argues that some students' actions threaten U.S. foreign policy interests. Nick Schifrin has more on the policy and its implications.
When Mahmoud Khalil, a Palestinian student activist at Columbia University, was arrested in early March, the Justice Department submitted a brief that included a memo signed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He wrote, quote, "An alien is deportable from the United States if the Secretary of State has reasonable ground to believe that the alien's presence or activities in the U.S. would have potentially serious adverse foreign policy consequences for the United States." Rubio wrote that Khalil and another unnamed fellow green card holders' public actions and continued presence undermine U.S. policy to combat anti-Semitism around the world and in the United States, in addition to efforts to protect Jewish students. It's unclear how many cases the State Department has invoked foreign policy when it comes to visa revocations or deportations, but it's also cited in court documents filed in the case of Young Seo Chung, a green card holder originally from South Korea who, like Khalil, protested the war in Gaza on Columbia University's campus. Last month, Rubio said this when asked why the State Department was taking these steps.
I don't care what movement you're involved in. Why would any country in the world allow people to come and disrupt? Now, we gave you a visa to come and study and get a degree, not to become a social activist that tears up our university campuses. And if we've given you a visa and then you decide to do that, we're going to take it away. It might be more than 300 at this point. We do it every day. Every time I find one of these lunatics, I take away their visa.
To discuss these visa revocations and attempted deportations and their link to foreign policy, we get 2 views. Chad Wolf is the executive vice president of the America First Policy Institute and the former acting secretary of the Department of Homeland Security during the first Trump administration. And Richard Haass is the president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations and author of the weekly Substack, Home and Away. Richard Haass, Chad Wolf, thank you very much. Welcome to the NewsHour. Richard Haass, let me start with you. Do you believe it is in the U.S. foreign policy interest to revoke these visas and possibly deport these student activists?
As a rule, no. Foreign students, we have about 1 million of them in the country right now. They contribute to the economy. If they stay here, there's a lot of Fortune 100 companies that began because of international students. If they become elites in their country, then we have pro-American elites. They also contribute financially to American colleges and universities. They're central to the business model. So I think this is a win-win-win situation. And I think we interfere with this program really at our peril. And coming back to what Marco Rubio was saying, if American foreign policy is that fragile, that the comments of a couple of kids on campuses is going to somehow jeopardize American foreign policy, then we've got much bigger problems than a few international students. Last I checked, we won the Cold War, we won the Gulf War, we've had a lot of other accomplishments in the world, despite the fact that we've had some critical voices in international students. So let's not overreact to what is a really, really small issue.
Are the comments, Chad Wolf, are the actions of foreign students a threat to U.S. foreign policy?
Well, look, I think they can be. Again, we're talking about, and I think you heard Secretary Rubio talk about maybe 300 students that he's revoked out of 1 million. So we're not talking about half. We're talking about less than 0.5%. DHS certainly has the right to remove students from the United States. I think it's important to remember that a student visa is a benefit that the United States government provides that individual to come over here and study. It's not a right. You have to adhere to certain requirements in order to maintain your visa and stay here in the United States. And if government officials like Secretary Rubio determine that you have violated the requirements of that student visa, then absolutely, if you want to continue to openly support a foreign terrorist organization, well, guess what? You're not going to do that from the United States. You're going to do it elsewhere.
Richard Haass, take those points on. It's a small percentage of these students, and as Chad Wolf just said, and as Rubio has alleged, these students are described as supporting Hamas, even though they describe themselves as protesting Israel.
To be critical of Israel does not make one an anti-Semite. Even to be sympathetic, for various Palestinian movements, I draw the line at support for violence, for raising money for organizations like Hamas. If they cross that line, we have ways of dealing for it. Indeed, we have two systems here for dealing with it. One is the American legal system. If someone crosses lines, and I would say this would apply to anyone, an American citizen or an international student, we have ways of dealing with it. Or secondly, the colleges and universities have their own codes of conduct, and they have due process they can offer, and then they have remedies. But otherwise, I think we've got to have a fairly open idea about free speech. And again, American foreign policy can handle even the jaundiced views, however we might find them objectionable, of some international students.
Chad Wolf, why should the U.S. government, why should the Secretary of State be involved in this when there are instances of due process of the courts taking this up, or in fact the universities themselves?
Well, sure. Again, this isn't about free speech. This is about a line that is crossed when individuals can go out there and they can criticize President Trump, they can criticize any politician for almost any reason. But when they advocate for support for a terrorist organization, that is where I think the majority of the Americans, certainly President Trump and his team, say that is a line too far. And this idea that we're going to let higher ed kind of police themselves, I think most Americans would say that's absolutely a joke. We saw where Columbia and Harvard and all these folks, they weren't doing anything, while Jewish students were absolutely afraid to go out of their dorms and onto these campuses. It's been clear that these schools cannot police themselves. So don't think that this is the first time that we're removing students out of the U.S. It's certainly not. Obviously, these are higher profile cases, so they're garnering a lot more attention.
Richard Haass, is there a question of these campuses being able to do this?
Well, after October 7, 2023, I think we saw on many campuses, including Columbia, that the universities were not handling it right. And the interests and rights and safety of Jewish students and other students, for that matter, was compromised. Since then, there's been an awful lot of learning and an awful lot of reform on campuses. The question that where the line to be drawn, at what point does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism, that's a big conversation. And it's not necessarily one I think the Secretary of State ought to be spending his time working on. Again, that I think is for campuses, and it's really a larger conversation in this country about what is legitimate criticism of Israel and where does criticism of Israel cross the line and it becomes illegitimate.
And finally, Chad Wolf, in the time we have left, are there any questions for you on due process in this case? Khalil, some of these others who were specifically named by Rubio have said that they themselves committed no violence. They don't support Hamas. They were only protesting Israeli actions.
What I have found in many of these cases is there's more information that's not in the public domain. The background on these individuals, what they did in their home countries, their associations, and other things that are at play here that U.S. law enforcement is looking at, DHS is looking at, as they take these certain actions to remove these individuals. There's a lot of work that goes into each of these. It's not just, hey, we see someone making public comments on TV, let's go remove them. But surely, if anyone questions that, they should have the right to say, hey, you're saying, this person needs to remove. I'm not that person. I think in that call, it is the federal government's call to make.
And not
again,
not
it's a benefit. Again, no one's entitled to a student visa. The United States, like any other country, provides you a benefit to come here. And we expect you to meet certain requirements of that student visa, and if you choose not to, then it should be the United States' federal government's position to be able to remove you.
Chad Wolf, Richard Haass, thank you very much.
Policies of the Trump administration are having a separate effect on higher ed, namely student loans and debt. Next month, the Department of Education will resume collections of defaulted student loans, ending a 5-year pause that began during the pandemic. As part of the process, the government will withhold tax refunds or Social Security and garnish wages to recover the debt. Right now, more than 5 million borrowers are already in default, with millions more at risk. Danielle Douglas Gabriel covers higher education for The Washington Post and joins us now. It's great to have you here. So help us understand why the administration is making this change and why now?
So honestly, this was always the plan. When the Biden administration, before leaving office, they had ended a number of programs that had really kind of softened the return to repayment. Now, if you recall, student loans resumed back in 2023. Then the Biden administration gave borrowers an additional 12-month grace period, whereby if you were to miss a payment or be late on a payment, it wouldn't count against you. That was over in September 2024. And I think now we're starting to see the consequences of the end of that grace period. A lot of borrowers I've spoken with in the last couple of months have said that they weren't even aware that student loans had fully gone back into repayment. And so many of them accidentally missed payments for several months. At least that's what they're saying to me. And now we're starting to see the consequences of that. I think around February, you were starting to hear about people whose credit score started to drop because the department had to, and student loan servicers that manage the loans had to report their late payments to the credit bureaus. And so there are about 4 million people who are 90 days past due on their student loans. And so there's a real fear right now that many of those people, if there isn't an intervention and they don't start making payments or find a plan that they could afford, they could go into full-blown default later this year. And if that were to happen and they're past a full year of not making payments, well, that's when you start to see things like the government garnishing your wages. That's when they can start seizing your tax refunds, seizing Social Security benefits. And certainly we don't want to see that for any American, especially because the consequences are so severe and people are really worried about their economic status at this stage.
Well, I was going to ask you when the collections will officially resume, but it sounds like it started already.
Certainly, at least the reporting of missed payments to the credit bureaus. And that's like the first couple of stages. There are many stages to being delinquent on your loans before you hit full-blown default. Usually the government considers you in default by 270 days. They start reporting you full-fledged in 360 days. But before that, if you are 60 days past due or 90 days past due, you'll start to see the effects on your credit score, which can make it difficult to get a mortgage, to get a car loan, or even rent an apartment.
And Danielle, because of the Trump administration's prior dismantling of the education department, we are hearing accounts of borrowers having a hard time getting in touch with a real person at the department if they have questions about their loans. Based on your reporting, what can people do?
I mean, that has been a serious challenge. You know, certainly your first line of defense is contacting your student loan servicer. These are companies like Nelnet, Mohila, contractors that work for the department. But they're going to be inundated with calls, I expect. And the Department of Education, the Federal Student Aid Office, has kind of been the backup here, where borrowers can call if they have complaints. But as a part of the Trump administration's efforts to close the Department of Education, a lot of the people who worked at the Federal Student Aid Office have left, lost their jobs, or just resigned.
And lastly, on a separate topic, today more than 180 leaders of higher education from around the country released a joint statement condemning the administration's efforts to control universities. And part of the letter reads this way: "We are open to constructive reform and do not oppose legitimate government oversight. However, we must oppose undue government intrusion in the lives of those who learn, live, and work on our campuses. We must reject the coercive use of public research funding." And this, of course, is a day after Harvard sued the Trump administration over the decision to freeze billions of dollars in federal funds. What are the implications of the Trump administration's confrontations with colleges and universities for funding, for campus climate, and the role of higher education in our democracy?
I think there's a real threat and a real concern that the administration's efforts could undo years of research advancements and really set the United States back in its role of being a leading edge place for innovation, and that innovation has come at our research universities, many of which are the subject of these sorts of investigations for not doing enough to curtail anti-Semitism on their campuses. And there are real concerns about rising anti-Semitism across the country. Many of these schools have enumerated the steps that they're taking to try to fix this. But the administration's tactics have left a lot of institutions fearful that there is no real way to satisfy them. If you look at what happened with Columbia, Columbia tried to negotiate in good faith with the administration and still did not receive the $400 million in research funding that was frozen. And I think after Harvard made the decision to rebuke the administration's demands and then ultimately filed this lawsuit earlier this week, you've seen a lot more university leaders willing to speak up and say that they are not going to let the federal government tell them what to teach, who to hire, or how they have to conduct the business of their universities, because it would be detrimental to the U.S.'s standing within higher education.
Danielle Douglas Gabriel of The Washington Post, always a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.
As the first Asian and only South Asian actress to be nominated for a Best Actress Oscar, Merle Oberon's place in the pantheon of cinema is historic, but it came with enormous sacrifice. For decades, Oberon had to hide her race to stay working in film. I recently spoke with writer Mayok Sen, whose new book, Love, Queenie, Merle Oberon, Hollywood's first South Asian star, chronicles Oberon's rise to fame, her groundbreaking career, and eventual fade from the spotlight. It's part of our Arts and Culture series, Canvas. Mayok, welcome to the NewsHour. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Amna.
So before we dive into the details of Merle Oberon's life, tell me how the book came to be. I mean, what was it about her and her story that made you want to dig in?
So I have always been fascinated by Merle Oberon ever since I first encountered her, which was all the way back in the summer of 2009. I was a rising senior in high school, and I was obsessed with the Oscars. And I learned that she had been the first Asian actress who was nominated for an Academy Award for acting all the way back in 1936. And then I learned that she had grown up in the city of Kolkata, which is where my father was from. And so ever since then, I've really wanted to tell her story, and there hasn't been a proper biography of her in over 40 years. So I told myself, you know what? I think it's time for me to just take this project on and try to do her story justice.
And the story that most people knew about her as she was making her way through Hollywood was that she was a British actress, that she was born in Tasmania, that she was raised in India, then brought to England. That's the story she told people. What was the truth about her life?
So something that emerged in the years after her death in 1979 was that Merle Oberon, despite posturing before the public eye as this white Tasmanian-born woman was in fact born into poverty in the city that was then known as Bombay, now Mumbai, India, to a South Asian mother and a white father. And she spent the first 18 years of her life in India living through poverty. And it was only after she went to England in 1929 that this fictitious backstory was created for her by studios that she was actually a white woman born in Tasmania, and that is a lie that would stick with her throughout the entirety of her life, at least publicly.
What did it mean to grow up mixed race in India in the early 1900s?
Yeah, so Merle Oberon, she was born as Queenie Thompson in India, right? And many Anglo-Indians, Merle Oberon included, grew up, having to deal with intense social discrimination because of the fact that they were essentially neither here nor there. They didn't easily assimilate into the wider South Asian population, and they were also almost always rejected by white British folks.
And the context for when she comes to the United States, as you point out in the book, is again one of real overt racism towards South Asians, right? There was an Immigration Act that barred South Asians from entry. Hollywood had a code in place that barred any interracial romance on screen. You write in the book that her identity was a secret she guarded with her life. What would have happened if people had found out?
So her career would have been completely destroyed had people known that she was, in fact, a mixed-race girl who was born into poverty in India. The Hays Code, which was instituted in 1934, which is coincidentally the same year that Merle Oberon first arrives in America. For example, one of its edicts barred the depiction of interracial romance, which was defined in the text as being between black and white races, but produced such a chilling effect that it also affected the opportunities for non-black people of color, including Merle Oberon. So had people known that she was actually mixed race and South Asian, she would not have been able to play any leading roles. So.
And she does land some roles, right? She stars opposite of Laurence Olivier as Kathy in Wuthering Heights, as Anne Boleyn in The Private Life of Henry VIII. How does she hide her identity? What does she have to do?
It requires enormous sacrifice. First, she's armed with this backstory that was created for her all the way back in 1932 by a company called London Films. They're the ones that say, you know what, we're going to give you this fictitious backstory that will essentially deflect any sort of curiosity or speculation about your heritage, right? And alongside that, she has to endure so many terrible and torturous, frankly, beauty regimens. When she was making the 1935 film The Dark Angel, which is the film for which she received her historic Best Actress nomination, she had to undergo an entire day of skin bleaching because studio crew essentially thought that she was too dark. And this is something that she had to go through routinely as she was making films in Hollywood.
What kind of impact did that take on her, not just on her career, but her personally, psychologically?
I think that it really incurred such a deep psychological cost on her. And what I found as I was writing my book and really spending a lot of time with the archives and her personal papers is that she was essentially in this dance between having to deny who she was in public while in private still keeping in touch with her family members from India. And that sort of tension, I think, really reached a boiling point later in her life.
You write also in the book that the words forgotten and overlooked get thrown around rather indiscriminately these days, but they apply to Merle. Why do you say that? What do you think her legacy is today?
When it comes to conversations about Asian identity in America, so often I find people fixate on East Asian or Southeast Asian identity, not necessarily South Asian identity, which is what Merle's story represents. Alongside that, I would say the fact that she's mixed race has sometimes disqualified her from these conversations about representation. And then, of course, you add to the fact that she passed as white and she had to deny her heritage. But I do find that in terms of Merle's legacy, what she was really fighting for, whether she was conscious of it or not, was an entertainment ecosystem in which people, especially performers of color, did not have the roles that were available to them dictated purely by their race. This is a South Asian woman who grew up in poverty, who went on to play Kathy in Wuthering Heights, this canonically white role.
Heathcliff, make the world stop right here.
She was a leading lady and a box office draw and a total star in the 30s and 40s. And I do think that there's so many South Asian performers working today who are indebted to her, whether they realize it or not.
The book is Love, Queenie. The author is Mayuk Sen. Thank you so much for being here. Such a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you, Amna.
And remember, there's a lot more online, including a look at what President Trump's tariffs could mean for auto manufacturers and consumers. That is at pbs.org/newshour.
And join us again here tomorrow night when Judy Woodruff travels to Springfield, Ohio, once an immigration flashpoint, still dealing with the national scrutiny. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Jeff Bennett.
And I'm Amna Nawaz. On behalf of the entire NewsHour team, thank you for joining us.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by
moving our economy for 160 years. BNSF, the engine that connects us.
Cunard is a proud supporter of public television. On a voyage with Cunard, the world awaits. A world of flavor, diverse destinations, and immersive experiences. A world of leisure and British style. All with Cunard's White Star service.
the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. For more than 50 years, advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world. At hewlett.org. Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.